Well, a new Pew Research poll says Americans are more divided along ideological lines than at any point in the last 2 decades. Now, this trend manifests itself in a myriad of ways, both in everyday life and in gridlock in our nation's capital. Earlier, I sat down with E.J. Dionne, the author of the bestseller, Why Americans Hate Politics, and asked him about the seemingly broken state of our federal government. Mr. Dionne, in the decades that you have covered the national scene of politics, how have you seen Washington, D.C.? How have you seen it change?
Well, I think, sometimes things are cliches for a reason. I do think we're more polarized. I think the parties are more polarized. I think, in particular, the Republicans have moved well to the right of where they used to be. But more generally, I think that there is even less contact at the social level across these lines. Some of it is simple things like fewer people stay in Washington the way they used to for much of the year. So the kids went to school together. So you were rooting for the team of someone who you radically disagreed with because your kids were playing baseball or football or soccer together. A lot of that's gone too. And so you have political factors sort of pushing us apart, but then you have some of these other factors pushing us apart. And Bill Bishop wrote a book called The Big Sort, where we aren't even living near each other anymore. We tend to be divided in our neighborhoods and in our regions, obviously, in the country. So people don't even understand what the other person's saying. And I think this has gotten worse since I started covering politics.
From our perspective here in the middle of the country, it seems that the news that we get, that Congress can't really even get some of the simple things done anymore. Would that be fair?
Yeah, well, we've had these shutdowns and crises that are unnecessary. I think some of the problem is we talk way more about big versus small government and not what do we really want from government. Because I think the abstract argument divides us. But then if you ask a person whether they're conservative or liberal, would you want better schools for your kids? You want decent highways? Do you want community colleges that your kids could go to if they can't afford, if they got to go part-time or something? Most people, I think, regardless of their politics, would say, yeah, those are appropriate things for government to do. But we rarely have the conversation on the specific level, what should government do? We have this big ideological debate. And so, sure, in the abstract, government's unpopular. And yet, don't say that to tell a senior citizen, therefore we're going to take away your Medicare or Social Security. We've always had these two debates, one practical, one ideological. But I think the ideological has dominated the practical one more and more. And I think that causes a lot of the problems that we're confronting.
Do those of us in the media, do we have a role in what seemingly is some political dysfunction in the way that we cover Washington, D.C., and maybe we'll focus on, I won't call it trivial, but maybe the salacious, and maybe not focus on things that have long-term implications?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is there is a financial crisis in the older media which is really leading to less coverage of a lot of things. I mean, one of the things, I used to cover the state government in New York State, and if you look across the country, the people still doing it are doing the best job they can, but we have many, many fewer people covering every state capital, pretty much every state capital in the country. That's a bad thing. We have fewer people available to cover city halls or city council meetings. That's not because of some evil design by the media. It's because they're not making the money they used to make to support basic coverage of government. And I think that is, an important problem. And then I do think that we, in the media, it's not just scandals, which, scandals we've always covered. And we've become a little more inclined to cover sex scandals than we used to. We used to be more reticent about those kinds of things. But we've always covered scandals. I think it's that we almost nationalize every story too much. It's a funny thing for somebody in Washington to say. I'm here in Oklahoma, so I want to say to people, I'm not from inside the Beltway. I'm from Kevin Durant's hometown. We tend to sort of focus on this big national thing. And sure, on a lot of those big national questions, we're very divided. You look at the map at how blue some counties are and how red other counties are. And we tend to concentrate on one big story all the time. I think I do a lot of work on cable news, so I'm not knocking people I work for, but cable news, I think, has also pushed us toward the let's do one big story that gets a lot of ratings, as opposed to the kind of mix you tend to get, for example, still on the old evening news shows, which have bigger audiences, by the way, than we appreciate. But obviously those audiences have declined over the years.
And there's 24 hours to fill in cable news.
Right. You hear from a lot of people, why don't you guys cover good news? And we have our stock answers to that, where because the bad news tends to be bigger and more important. But I've always sympathized with that question. We're at a time when there is a declining confidence in all kinds of institutions in our country, and yet you look around, and there is stuff that works. There is the teacher who does an awesome job. There is, the pastor in a neighborhood that was full of crime who has really worked with his neighborhood to bring it back. There are actually politicians who care about their work. You almost never can admit that on television. And I wish we could find a way, not to do PR for anybody, but just to say, human beings are flawed, but they also can do pretty good things. And let's present a somewhat more balanced picture of how, our human project works.
We're here in a state where roughly 1 out of 3 eligible voters actually go to the polls. When we complain about our nation's lawmakers, do we have only ourselves to blame?
Well, up to a point, I agree with you, but I also think we make it exceptionally difficult for people to vote in our country, particularly young people who tend to move around, are less stable in their residential patterns than older people. I'm probably the only person you'll ever talk to who believes in the Australian system of compulsory voting, where you don't have to vote for anybody. You can draw Mickey Mouse on your ballot. You just have a civic obligation to show up. Now, one of the reasons I believe in compulsory voting is that would flip the assumptions around. I think government's job is to make it as easy as possible for eligible voters to vote. And if you created that obligation on the citizen to vote, then government's job is to say, okay, we're going to figure out ways in which you can fulfill that obligation. And I know this idea will never fly in our country, but it works very well down in Australia. And one of the things it does is you save an awful lot of money on campaigns. Think of all the money that's raised just to turn out the vote. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows they have to vote. And again, if you don't want to cast a ballot for any of these guys, you don't have to. But I think it's a civic obligation that is fair to ask people to fulfill, but then you've got to make it possible for them to fulfill it.
Do you still believe in our political system and believe it maybe is the best in the world?
I believe democracy is the best system in the world because I don't trust any government that doesn't get its source of power from the people. And so in that sense, yes. Do I think there are flaws in our system we need to fix to save our democracy? You bet. I'm very worried about the role of big money in politics, and I think that's a problem. I think a lot of people, when you have an economic situation like we have had in some ways, over 20 years, where a lot of people in the middle and also at the bottom of the economy don't have the same faith they had before that they can get ahead, they begin to ask questions about the whole system, including the democratic system. So I think giving everybody a fair shot in the economy is actually essential to saving our democracy. I was a foreign correspondent. I've covered a lot of different kinds of governments. And I'd much rather have a constitution that begins with the words, "We the people."
E.J. Dionne, thank you for your insights.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, if you'd like to see another view of how to break through all this federal gridlock, I do have my conversation with President Bush's press secretary, Ari Fleischer, streaming on our website under this week's Value Added section.